It was a quiet evening in the heart of the city, where the hum of traffic and the occasional laughter from street corners blended into the rhythm of the night. The air carried a slight chill, urging people to wrap themselves tighter in their coats as they hurried along. Among them was Marcus, a towering figure with broad shoulders, a slow, deliberate stride, and a warm smile that made him seem approachable despite his size. Marcus was a man of simplicity. He wasn't one to boast about his past, and he lived his life quietly, spending most of his days volunteering at the local youth center and enjoying solitary walks in the evenings to clear his mind. But Marcus wasn't just any man. Beneath his calm demeanor and unassuming presence was a story, a past he had chosen to leave behind. Years ago, Marcus was known by a different name in a different world. Back then, he was a celebrated MMA champion, feared and respected in the ring for his unmatched power and discipline. He had walked away from it all at the peak of his career, tired of the endless cycle of violence and eager for a life of peace. Few in his current neighborhood knew of his legacy, and that's how Marcus liked it. To them, he was just Marcus, the kind, fat man who always had time to listen and help. That night, Marcus decided to take a detour through a less busy street on his way home. It was quieter there, with dimly lit sidewalks and small, shuttered businesses lining the road. He appreciated the solitude, the way the night seemed to wrap around him like an old, familiar blanket. As he strolled, he heard faint laughter echoing from a distance. At first, he thought nothing of it. People laughed all the time. What harm could that bring? But the sound grew louder, closer, and carried with it a sharpness that made Marcus's instincts stir. The laughter was followed by voices, low at first but rising steadily. There was a tone to them, mocking, taunting. Marcus's steps slowed as he glanced ahead. A group of young men stood clustered under a flickering streetlight, their postures aggressive, their faces shadowed but unmistakably confrontational. They weren't laughing anymore. Instead, their voices carried a mix of slurs and insults that echoed off the walls of the narrow street. "Hey, big guy," one of them called out, his tone dripping with mockery. "You lost or something? Or did you just eat the wrong street for dinner?" The group burst into laughter, their voices ringing out like a twisted chorus. Marcus stopped, his calm eyes scanning the scene. He wasn't one to react to provocation, but the words carried an all-too-familiar sting. He had heard them before, growing up in a world that judged him for the color of his skin and the size of his body. He had learned to let those words roll off his back, to rise above them. But this was different. The energy here was hostile, charged, and Marcus could feel it. The leader of the group stepped forward, his confidence fueled by the presence of his friends. He was wiry and cocky, with a smirk that screamed trouble. "What's the matter, big guy? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're too slow to come up with a comeback." Marcus took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he kept his composure. "I don't want any trouble," he said, his voice calm but firm. He didn't raise his hands or take a defensive stance. There was no need. His presence alone was intimidating enough, though he never intended it to be. But his calmness only seemed to agitate them further. The group closed in, their movements like a pack of wolves circling their prey. "Trouble? Nah, we're just having a little fun," one of them sneered, his words dripping with false innocence. "Unless, of course, you're scared." Marcus's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the familiar surge of adrenaline that he hadn't felt in years. He had promised himself never to return to that mindset, to the fighter he once was. Violence wasn't the answer. It never truly was. But as the gang drew closer, their words escalating to threats, Marcus realized he might not have a choice. "You really don't want to do this," Marcus said, his voice carrying a warning that went unheeded. "Oh, we do," the leader shot back, pulling something from his pocket. It glinted under the dim light, a knife. Marcus's eyes flickered to it for a split second, his mind calculating every possible outcome. The old instincts were waking up, the training he had buried deep within himself, clawing its way to the surface. The gang laughed again, mistaking Marcus's silence for fear. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. They didn't know that the man they were taunting wasn't just a fat guy walking home. They didn't know about the years he had spent in the cage, fighting opponents twice as fast and twice as fierce as any of them. They didn't know about the discipline, the strategy, the power that still resided within him, waiting for a reason to resurface. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, barely noticeable to the untrained eye. But to anyone who knew what to look for, it was a tell, a subtle signal that the fight was already over before it began. Still, he held back, giving them one last chance to walk away. "I'm asking you nicely," he said, his voice steady and unshaken. "Let me go. Nobody needs to get hurt tonight." The leader scoffed, his smirk widening. "You've got it all wrong, old man. *Q*, the one who's gonna get hurt." And then, as if on cue, the gang lunged forward. Time seemed to slow, the world narrowing down to the moment at hand. Marcus's mind went blank, his body taking over with a precision and grace that was almost otherworldly. The first swing came from his left, a wild punch aimed at his head. Marcus ducked effortlessly, his movements smooth and fluid. The second attacker tried to grab him from behind, but Marcus spun out of reach, his large frame moving with a speed that defied expectation. The knife came next, slashing through the air, but Marcus caught the attacker's wrist, twisting it with enough force to disarm him without breaking a bone. The gang was stunned. This wasn't the easy target they had expected. Their laughter was gone, replaced by confusion and fear as Marcus dismantled that every move with ease. He didn't strike back. He didn't need to. His presence, his control, and his sheer skill were enough to dominate the situation. But just as Marcus began to think the ordeal was over, a noise from the alley caught his attention, a faint shuffle, like someone watching from the shadows. Marcus turned his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything changed. The gang regrouped, their fear momentarily forgotten as they took advantage of his distraction. Marcus braced himself, his mind racing with possibilities. But what he saw next wasn't an attack. It was something else entirely, something that made his blood run cold. And in that moment, Marcus knew this night wasn't over. Not yet. Marcus's breath slowed, the world around him sharpening with unnerving clarity. The shuffling noise in the shadows grew louder, sending a chill down his spine. It wasn't the gang. It was something else, someone else. His eyes darted toward the source, trying to make out the figure lurking just beyond the reach of the streetlight. For a moment, time felt frozen, the tension hanging thick in the air. Then, from the darkness, a man stepped forward, older, wiry, and carrying an air of authority that made the gang fall silent. His face was partially obscured by the hood of his jacket, but Marcus caught the sharp glint of his eyes. The man wasn't part of the gang. Marcus could tell by the way they looked at him, a mix of uncertainty and deference. Whoever he was, he had their respect, or perhaps their fear. "Enough," the man said, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight, the kind that made people listen. The gang hesitated, glancing between him and Marcus, unsure of what to do. The leader opened his mouth to protest, but the older man silenced him with a single look. Marcus didn't move, his body still primed for action. He studied the newcomer, trying to piece together who he was and why he was here. The man stepped closer, his movements deliberate and measured, like someone who was used to being in control. As he approached, Marcus noticed the faint scar running down his cheek, a reminder of a past that probably wasn't too different from Marcus's own. "You've got guts," the man said, addressing Marcus directly. His tone wasn't hostile, but it wasn't friendly either. "Walking through here alone, looking like that." He gestured vaguely toward Marcus's broad frame, as though his size and presence were enough to invite trouble. "I wasn't looking for trouble," Marcus replied evenly, "just trying to get home." The man tilted his head, studying Marcus with an intensity that made him uneasy. "Home, huh? Funny place to be passing through for a quiet night. His words hung in the air, challenging but not outright accusatory. Marcus didn't respond, unwilling to give anything away. He wasn't sure what this man wanted, but he wasn't about to play along. The gang watched the exchange in tense silence, their earlier bravado now replaced by unease. Marcus could see it in their faces, the way they shifted uncomfortably, their confidence shaken by how easily he had neutralized their attacks. They weren't used to losing control, and they didn't like it. The man turned to the gang, his expression hardening. "Go," he said sharply, "now." The leader hesitated, his pride wounded, but a single glance from the man was enough to make him back down. One by one, the gang dispersed, muttering under their breath as they disappeared into the night. Marcus didn't relax, not yet. The man was still there, his gaze fixed on Marcus, like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "You've got some skills," the man said after a long pause. "Not the kind you pick up from a YouTube video." His lips curled into a faint smirk, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Who are you?" Marcus met his gaze, his expression unreadable. Just a guy trying to mind his own business. The man chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. "Sure, let's go with that." He took a step closer, and Marcus's muscles tensed involuntarily. The man noticed and held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Relax, I'm not here to fight you. If I was, you'd know it." The statement hung in the air, and Marcus wasn't sure whether to take it as a threat or an acknowledgement of his own capabilities. Either way, he didn't trust this man, not for a second. "What do you want?" Marcus asked, his voice steady. The man shrugged, as though the question didn't require a straight answer. "Let's just say I'm curious. Guys like you don't just show up out of nowhere. You've got a past, and I'm willing to bet it's an interesting one." Marcus didn't respond. He wasn't about to explain himself to a stranger, especially not one who seemed to know more than he should. The man's smirk widened, as though he could read Marcus's thoughts. "Well," the man said, taking a step back, "whatever your story is, you might want to keep a low profile. This isn't the kind of place where people forget easily." He turned and started to walk away, but before he disappeared into the shadows, he glanced over his shoulder. "Oh, and Marcus." His voice was quieter now, but it carried the same weight as before. "Next time, pick a different route." Marcus's stomach dropped. He hadn't told the man his name. He stood there for a long moment, staring after the stranger, his mind racing. How did he know who he was? And what else did he know? The walk home felt longer than usual that night. Every sound, every shadow seemed more significant, like the world had shifted in some small but important way. By the time Marcus reached his apartment, his mind was buzzing with questions he didn't have answers to. He locked the door behind him, double-checking it out of habit, and sank into the worn-out armchair in his living room. He couldn't shake the man's words, the way he had spoken with a confidence that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. And then there was the gang, kids who were clearly out to prove something, but to who? Marcus had grown up around people like them, kids who thought they were invincible until reality hit them hard. He didn't want to be the one to deliver that lesson, but tonight had forced his hand. As he sat there, staring at the darkened room, memories of his past began to creep in. He hadn't thought about his fighting days in years, but tonight had brought it all rushing back. The roar of the crowd, the sting of sweat and blood, the adrenaline that came with every fight. It was a world he had left behind, or so he thought. But the truth was, it had never really left him. It was still there, buried beneath the surface, waiting for a reason to resurface. Marcus ran a hand over his face, trying to push the memories away. He had worked too hard to build a new life for himself, one that didn't involve violence or fame. He wasn't that person anymore. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. But deep down, he knew tonight had changed something. The peaceful life he had built was no longer as simple as it seemed. The city, the gang, the stranger, they were all pieces of a puzzle he didn't yet understand. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized he couldn't just ignore it. Marcus stood and moved to the window, staring out at the city below. The lights stretched out in every direction, a reminder of how vast and complicated the world could be. Somewhere out there, the man with the scar was probably watching, waiting, planning, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. He didn't know what was coming, but one thing was certain. The quiet life he had worked so hard to create was no longer an option. Whatever this was, it was pulling him back into a world he had sworn to leave behind. And for the first time in years, Marcus felt the faint stirrings of the fighter he used to be, the man who didn't back down, who faced challenges head-on, no matter the cost. As the city buzzed around him, Marcus made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't run, not this time. Whatever was coming, he would face it. And this time, he wouldn't hold back. The next morning, the sun peeked through Marcus's window, casting streaks of golden light across the floor. It was the kind of quiet, peaceful start to the day he usually enjoyed. But today, the weight of the previous night lingered like a storm cloud hanging over him. Sleep had been restless, filled with fragmented memories of his past and flashes of the gang's mocking faces. He couldn't shake the man with the scar from his thoughts, the way he had stepped out of the shadows like he already knew the end of the story. Marcus brewed a pot of coffee, the familiar routine helping to ground him. As he sipped from his favorite mug, he glanced at his phone. There was a text from Sarah, the director of the youth center where he volunteered. She was checking in, asking if he could come in later to help with the kids. It was her way of looking out for him, even if she didn't say it outright. Marcus appreciated her kindness, but today he wasn't sure if he had the energy to face anyone. Still, the center was a safe haven, both for the kids and for him. It was where he poured his time and heart, trying to make up for all the years he felt he had taken too much from the world. The kids didn't know much about his past, just that he used to be an athlete. That was enough for them, and it was enough for Marcus too. He didn't want to be their hero, he just wanted to be someone they could count on. By the time Marcus arrived at the youth center, the place was already buzzing with activity. Kids ran back and forth across the gym, their laughter echoing off the walls. It was a sound that always brought him a sense of peace, but today it felt distant, like it was happening in another world. Marcus forced a smile as Sarah approached him, clipboard in hand and a look of relief on her face. "Marcus, you're a lifesaver," she said, her voice warm and familiar. "I was worried you'd bail on me today." "Never," Marcus replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "What do you need?" She handed him the clipboard, outlining the day's activities. There was a basketball game in the afternoon, followed by a mentoring session for the older kids. It was the kind of work Marcus enjoyed, the kind that reminded him why he had left his old life behind. For a few hours he could forget about the gang, the man with the scar, and the growing unease that had settled in his chest. But peace didn't last long. Just as the basketball game was wrapping up, Marcus noticed a group of kids huddled near the entrance. They were whispering, their faces pale and anxious. Marcus walked over, his presence immediately quieting them. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. One of the boys, a lanky teenager named Jamal, hesitated before speaking. There's some guys outside," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're just standing there watching." Marcus's stomach tightened. He moved toward the door, peeking through the window to see who it was. Sure enough, 3 men leaned casually against a car parked across the street. They weren't doing anything outright threatening, but their presence felt intentional. One of them caught Marcus's eye and smirked, a slow, deliberate gesture that sent a clear message. Marcus stepped back from the window, his mind racing. He didn't recognize the men, but their body language was unmistakable. They were there for him, and they wanted him to know it. He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to confront them. The kids didn't need to see that side of him, the side he had worked so hard to bury. Instead, Marcus turned back to Jamal and the other kids, forcing a reassuring smile. "Don't worry about them," he said. "They're just bored. Go back inside, okay?" Jamal nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. Marcus waited until the kids had gone before stepping outside. The men didn't move as he approached, their smirks growing wider with each step he took. "Can I help you?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice calm. One of the men, a stocky guy with a shaved head, chuckled. "We were just in the neighborhood," he said. "Thought we'd stop by, see what all the fuss is about." Marcus didn't take the bait. "You've seen it. Now move along." The man's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "You've got some nerve, talking to us like that," he said, his tone sharp. "You think last night was a one-off? You've got people watching you now. You've made some enemies." Marcus didn't flinch. "I'm not interested in whatever game you're playing. Leave these kids out of it." The man laughed again, a cold, mirthless sound. "Oh, we're not here for the kids. This is about you, big guy. You've got people asking questions, people who don't like loose ends." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Marcus's mind flashed back to the man with the scar, the gang, the growing sense that his past was catching up with him. He didn't know how these pieces fit together, but it was clear they weren't going away. "You tell whoever sent you," Marcus said, his voice low and steady, "that I'm not interested. They can find someone else to bother." The man's smirk returned, but there was no humor in it. "That's cute," he said, "but you don't get to decide when this ends." The men got back into their car and drove off, leaving Marcus standing there, his heart pounding. He didn't know what was coming, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just a random encounter. Someone out there wanted something from him, and they weren't going to stop until they got it. As Marcus walked back into the youth center, he couldn't shake the feeling that his peaceful life was unraveling, one thread at a time. The kids looked up at him, their faces full of trust and innocence, and Marcus knew he couldn't let them see his fear. Whatever was coming, he had to face it alone. He had to protect them, even if it meant confronting the parts of himself he had spent years trying to leave behind. That night, as Marcus sat in his apartment, the quiet felt heavier than ever. He thought about calling someone, Sarah, maybe, but what would he say? That he was being followed? That strangers were showing up, throwing cryptic warnings his way? He didn't have answers, and he didn't want to drag anyone else into his mess. But deep down, Marcus knew this wasn't something he could ignore. His past, his skills, the world he had tried to leave behind, it was all coming back, whether he was ready for it or not. And as much as he hated to admit it, a part of him, the fighter he used to be, was ready. The days that followed were anything but ordinary. Marcus started noticing things that didn't sit right. A car parked a little too long across the street. Strangers who lingered near the youth center, pretending to check their phones but always keeping an eye on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, studied, like prey. He kept his head down, trying to focus on the kids and their activities, but the tension was starting to show. Sarah pulled him aside one afternoon, her brow furrowed with concern. "Is everything okay, Marcus? You've been different lately," she said softly. "The kids can feel it." Marcus hesitated, debating how much to tell her. "I'm fine," he said finally, forcing a reassuring smile. "Just dealing with some personal stuff." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't push either. "If you ever need to talk, you know where to find me," she said before walking away. Her kindness only made the weight in his chest heavier. He hated lying to her, but the less she knew, the safer she'd be. That night, as Marcus walked home, he couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. The streets were quieter than usual, the hum of the city replaced by an eerie stillness. He glanced over his shoulder, his senses on high alert. Nothing. Just empty sidewalks and the distant glow of streetlights. Still, the tension in his muscles wouldn't ease. When he reached his apartment, he checked the locks twice before sinking onto the couch. His phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. He stared at it for a moment before answering, his voice cautious. "Hello, Marcus." The voice on the other end was deep, calm, and unsettlingly familiar. It was the man with the scar. Marcus's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you want?" "Just a chat," the man said, his tone casual. "I've been watching you. You've got an interesting life now, don't you? Quiet, peaceful, almost boring." Marcus didn't respond, his jaw clenched. "But that's not who you are, is it?" The man continued. "You can't hide from what you've done, from what you are. People remember, Marcus, and some of them aren't too happy about the way you walked away." "I don't care what they think," Marcus said, his voice low and firm. "That life is behind me." The man chuckled softly. "You think it's that simple? You think you can just disappear and no one will come looking?" He paused, letting the words sink in. "You've made some enemies, Marcus, and they've been waiting for this moment." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "If you were trying to scare me, you're wasting your time." "Scare you?" the man repeated, amusement in his voice. "No, Marcus. I'm just reminding you of the rules. You don't get to walk away from a fight without consequences. And trust me, the fight is coming. You won't see it coming, but when it does..." He let the sentence trail off, leaving the threat unspoken but heavy. The line went dead, leaving Marcus staring at his phone, his mind racing. He couldn't deny it anymore. This wasn't just random intimidation. This was deliberate, calculated. Whoever these people were, they had a plan, and Marcus was at the center of it. The next morning, Marcus found a note slipped under his door. It was simple, handwritten in a neat script. Asterisk, "Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th Street tonight. Come alone." Asterisk, there was no signature, but he didn't need one to know who it was from. He spent the day on edge, torn between ignoring the note and showing up to put an end to this once and for all. Every instinct told him it was a trap, but the alternative, doing nothing, was worse. If these people were willing to escalate, they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted, and Marcus couldn't let anyone else get caught in the crossfire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus laced up his worn sneakers and slipped on a dark hoodie. He didn't bother telling anyone where he was going. This was his fight, and he wasn't going to drag anyone else into it. The warehouse loomed ahead, its broken windows and rusted metal exterior giving it an air of decay. The faint hum of the city faded as Marcus stepped inside, the dim light from a single overhead bulb casting long shadows across the empty space. He wasn't alone. The man with the scar stood in the center of the room, flanked by two others, one of them the stocky man Marcus had confronted outside the youth center. They all watched him with cold, calculating eyes, their postures relaxed but ready for anything. "Right on time," the man with the scar said, his lips curling into a smile. "I knew you wouldn't disappoint." Marcus kept his distance, his muscles coiled like a spring. "What do you want from me?" The man tilted his head, feigning surprise. "What do I want?" "Oh, Marcus, this isn't about what I want. It's about what you owe. You think you can just walk away, start a new life, and no one will notice. No one will care." "I don't owe you anything," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I left that life behind for a reason." The man's smile faltered, replaced by a glint of anger in his eyes. "You don't get to decide when it ends," he said, his voice sharp. "You think you're better than us now. Playing the good guy, helping those kids. It's pathetic. You can't change who you are." Marcus took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "I'm not that person anymore." The man with the scar laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "We'll see about that," he said, nodding to the others. The tension in the room snapped like a rubber band. The two men lunged toward Marcus, their movements fast and aggressive. But Marcus was faster. The years away from the ring hadn't dulled his instincts. If anything, they had made him sharper, more deliberate. He dodged the first punch with ease, his counter-strike landing squarely in the man's gut. The second attacker swung wildly, but Marcus ducked under the blow, delivering a precise kick to his knee that sent him sprawling. It wasn't a fight. It was survival, and Marcus was fighting like a man who had everything to lose. The man with the scar didn't move, watching with an eerie calm as Marcus took down his men. When the last one hit the ground, groaning in pain, Marcus turned to him, his chest heaving. "Is that all you've got?" Marcus demanded, his voice filled with a quiet fury. The man with the scar smiled, his expression unreadable. "Oh, Marcus," he said softly, "this is just the beginning." Marcus stared at the man with the scar, his chest still rising and falling with the effort of the fight. The quiet confidence in the man's voice unsettled him more than the two attackers had. Something about the way he stood, calm and unshaken, sent a chill down Marcus's spine. He was too composed, as if this entire encounter had gone exactly the way he'd planned. Marcus didn't let his guard down. "What's your game?" he asked, his voice edged with frustration. "If you think sending these guys after me is going to scare me, you're wrong. I've dealt with worse." The man with the scar chuckled softly, taking a slow step forward. "Oh, Marcus, you've always been so predictable. Punch first, ask questions later. But this isn't about scaring you. It's about reminding you who you are." Marcus clenched his fists, his mind racing. The cryptic remarks, the calculated moves. It was clear this man knew far more about Marcus's past than he had let on. And yet, he wasn't giving anything away. The ambiguity was maddening. "Enough with the riddles," Marcus snapped. "If you've got something to say, say it." The man stopped, tilting his head as if considering Marcus's words. "You think you left it all behind, don't you? The fights, the violence, the reputation. You've convinced yourself you're a different man now, playing mentor to those kids. But you can't erase what you did, Marcus. You can't erase who you hurt." Marcus's jaw tightened. The memories he'd tried to bury surged to the surface. Faces, names, moments he regretted but couldn't change. "I've made my peace with my past," he said, his voice low but steady. "I don't owe anyone an explanation." The man's expression shifted, a flicker of something darker crossing his face. "Maybe not an explanation," he said slowly, "but you do owe someone. You think walking away was the end of the story. It wasn't. There's someone out there who's been waiting for this moment, Marcus. Waiting for you." Marcus felt his stomach drop. He had made enemies during his time in the ring, fighters who resented him, people who had bet and lost fortunes on his matches. But this felt different. It wasn't about revenge or money. It was personal. "Who?" Marcus demanded. "Who's behind this?" The man smiled again, a cold, knowing smile. "You'll find out soon enough. But here's the twist, Marcus. You already know them. Better than you think." Marcus's heart pounded as the man stepped back, gesturing to his fallen associates. "You've got a choice to make," he said. "Keep pretending you're someone else, or face the truth. Either way, the past is coming for you, and it won't stop." Before Marcus could respond, the man turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty warehouse. Marcus watched him go, his mind a storm of questions and unease. What did he mean, someone you already know? Who could possibly be behind this? And why now, after all these years? As the door slammed shut behind the man, Marcus stood alone in the silence, his fists still clenched. He had spent years trying to distance himself from his past, building a life that felt meaningful and real. But now that life felt fragile, like it could crumble at any moment. The next morning, Marcus couldn't shake the weight of the man's words. He tried to focus on the kids at the youth center, but his mind kept circling back to the cryptic warning. Someone from his past was pulling the strings, and whoever it was, they wanted him to remember the man he used to be. That afternoon, as Marcus helped Jamal with his basketball drills, he noticed a familiar figure standing by the fence. At first, he thought it was just another parent or passerby. But as he looked closer, his chest tightened. It was the same man who had been watching him days ago, the one with the shaved head who had confronted him outside the center. Marcus excused himself and walked toward the fence, his every step measured. The man didn't move, his expression blank, but his presence deliberate. "What are you doing here?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice low. The man didn't answer right away. He simply reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, holding it out to Marcus. "You'll want to see this," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. Marcus hesitated, his instincts screaming at him not to trust it, but his curiosity, and the growing sense that he needed answers, overrode his caution. He took the envelope, watching as the man turned and walked away without another word. Inside, Marcus found a single photograph and a handwritten note. The photo was old, faded at the edges, but the faces were unmistakable. It was Marcus, years ago, standing in the ring after a fight. Beside him was another fighter, battered but defiant, a man Marcus recognized instantly. The note was short, written in the same neat script as the message under his door. Asterisk left him behind. He hasn't forgotten asterisk. Marcus's breath caught as the pieces began to click into place. The man in the photo wasn't just another opponent. He was someone Marcus had known well. Someone he had trained with, fought alongside, and ultimately betrayed in ways that still haunted him. The realization hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about settling old scores. This was about loyalty, trust, and the broken bonds he had tried so hard to forget. And now that betrayal was staring him in the face, demanding to be reckoned with. As Marcus stared at the photo, the tension in his chest tightened. The stakes weren't just about his own safety anymore. This was about unfinished business, choices that couldn't be undone, and the people he had left behind. The past wasn't just catching up to him, it was driving him back, forcing him to confront everything he had tried to leave behind. And this time, there was no running from it. The warehouse was silent, except for the sound of Marcus's steady breathing. His hands trembled slightly as he stared at the photograph, the weight of the past pressing down on him like a heavy shadow. The man in the picture, battered and defiant, wasn't just anyone. He was Darryl, a former teammate, someone Marcus had once called a brother. Their bond had been forged in the fire of endless training sessions, grueling fights, and shared victories. But it had been broken, shattered by a choice Marcus had made when he was younger and more reckless. Marcus had betrayed Darryl, not with malice, but with ambition. There had been a fight, one that could make or break their careers, and Marcus had taken an opportunity to undercut Darryl's chances. It wasn't personal. It had been survival. The guilt had followed Marcus ever since, but he had convinced himself it was in the past, that Darryl had moved on just as he had. Now, holding the photo in his hands, he realized how wrong he had been. That night, Marcus made his decision. He couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding behind the life he had built. If Darryl wanted a confrontation, Marcus would give it to him, but on his own terms. He returned to the youth center after hours, locking the door behind him and turning off the lights. The place felt different in the dark, quieter, more serious. He took his time wrapping his hands, the familiar ritual grounding him, reminding him of who he was and who he needed to be. As the hours passed, the anticipation grew. He knew Darryl would come. He could feel it in his bones. And sure enough, just before midnight, the faint sound of footsteps echoed outside. The door creaked open, and Marcus turned to face the man he hadn't seen in years. Darryl stood in the doorway, his presence commanding. He was leaner than Marcus remembered, but still imposing, his sharp eyes filled with a mixture of anger and hurt. He carried himself with the same confidence he'd always had, but there was something darker in his demeanor now, something that spoke of years of resentment and unresolved pain. "So," Darryl said, stepping inside and letting the door close behind him, "you finally stopped hiding." "I wasn't hiding," Marcus said evenly, though he knew how hollow the words sounded. Darryl let out a bitter laugh. "That's funny. From where I'm standing, it looks like you've been hiding your whole life. Playing the good guy, pretending to care about those kids. But you can't erase who you are, Marcus. You can't undo what you did." Marcus held his ground, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to undo anything, Darryl. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But if you're looking for an apology, I'm not sure it'll be enough." Darryl's expression darkened. "You think I came here for an apology? No, Marcus. I came here to remind you what you did to me, to make you feel what I felt. You took everything from me, my shot, my career, my pride. And you walked away like it didn't matter. Marcus took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving Daryl's. It did matter, he said quietly. It mattered more than you know. I made a mistake, Daryl. I was selfish. I was scared. And I've spent every day since then trying to be better, to make up for it in some way. Daryl's fists clenched at his sides. Better. You think helping a few kids wipes a slate clean? You don't get to decide when the score is settled, Marcus. That's up to me. For a moment, the tension in the room was palpable, the silence thick with unspoken words. Then, without warning, Daryl lunged. His movements were fast and precise, honed by years of experience, but Marcus was ready. He met Daryl's attack head-on, their bodies colliding with a force that sent them both reeling. The fight was brutal, a clash of skill and raw emotion. Every punch, every block, every movement was charged with years of history and pain. But as the fight wore on, something began to shift. Marcus didn't fight to win. He fought to survive, to prove that he wasn't the man Daryl thought he was. And Daryl, for all his anger, seemed to hold back, as if unsure whether he truly wanted to destroy the man in front of him. Finally, they broke apart, both of them breathing hard, their bodies battered but their spirits unbroken. Marcus raised his hands, signaling that he didn't want to continue. Enough, he said, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. If this is what you needed, fine. But this won't change anything, Daryl. It won't take away what happened. Daryl stared at him, his chest heaving. You don't get it, do you? This was never about the fight. This is about making you face what you did, about making you see me. I'm not just a face in a photograph, Marcus. I'm not just your past. I'm here. I've always been here. The words hit Marcus harder than any punch. He realized then that Daryl wasn't just looking for revenge. He was looking for acknowledgement, for validation, for proof that his pain hadn't been forgotten. And in that moment, Marcus understood what he needed to do. I see you, Marcus said, his voice soft but sincere. I see you, Daryl, and I'm sorry. Not just for what I did, but for how long it took me to say it. You didn't deserve what happened. None of it. For a long moment, Daryl didn't respond. Then, slowly, he lowered his hands, the tension in his body easing. You can't fix this, Marcus, he said quietly. But maybe you can try. Marcus nodded, the weight in his chest lifting just slightly. It wasn't a resolution, it was a beginning. A chance to rebuild what had been broken, one step at a time. As Daryl turned to leave, Marcus called out to him, Daryl, if you ever want to talk, you know where to find me. Daryl paused, glancing back with a faint smile. I'll think about it, he said before disappearing into the night. Marcus stood alone in the empty gym, the echoes of their fight still lingering in the air. The past hadn't been erased, but it felt lighter now, less suffocating. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope, not just for himself, but for the possibility of healing the wounds he had left behind. The morning after the fight with Daryl, Marcus woke up early, the usual quiet of the youth center now interrupted by the weight of everything that had transpired. He stood by the window, looking out over the street, but his thoughts weren't on the view. His mind was still spinning with the conversation he had with Daryl. The words they'd shared, the apology that had felt so necessary, the realization of just how deep their broken bond had run, it all lingered in the air like the remnants of a storm. Marcus knew that nothing would be the same now. Daryl had been right. He couldn't fix everything, but he could try. And that was what he needed to do. Try. For himself, for Daryl, and for the kids who looked up to him. But first, he needed to put his own house in order. The past few days had been a blur of emotions. The confrontation with the gang, the unexpected appearance of Daryl, and the weight of the truth about his betrayal had all collided in a way Marcus hadn't anticipated. But somewhere in all that chaos, there had been clarity, a realization that he couldn't continue running from the past. He had to face it head-on. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over the center, Marcus made his way downstairs to the gym. The place was quiet, the stillness of the morning offering a moment of peace. The walls, once filled with the echoes of his past, now felt like a canvas, a place where he could rebuild, not just for himself, but for the community he had become a part of. Later that afternoon, Marcus received an unexpected call. It was from one of the kids from the center, Jamal. "Yo, coach," Jamal said, his voice buzzing with energy. "I heard about what went down with you and those guys last week. You good?" Marcus smiled, feeling a sense of pride that Jamal cared enough to reach out. "I'm fine, Jamal. Thanks for checking in." "Man, I know you've been through a lot," Jamal continued, "but I've been thinking about something. You've always told us that we gotta face our problems, right? Not run from them." Marcus paused, leaning against the wall as he absorbed Jamal's words. "Yeah, that's right." "Well," Jamal said, his voice growing more serious, "you're the one who taught me that. And now it's time for you to show us, not just talk about it." Marcus chuckled softly, touched by Jamal's directness. "You're right. I've been talking a lot about facing our demons. It's about time I do the same." The call ended with a promise from Marcus to return to the gym and keep working with the kids. But there was something more to it now, a deeper sense of responsibility. The center wasn't just a place where he helped kids learn to defend themselves. It was where he had to defend something bigger. He had to stand firm in the face of his own history and show the next generation that growth was possible, even when the past weighed heavy. Over the next few weeks, Marcus worked tirelessly with the kids at the center, not just on physical training, but on life lessons too. The impact of the lessons he had learned from his own journey was now coming full circle. He was teaching them about resilience, discipline, and redemption, things he hadn't fully understood until recently. It wasn't about perfection, it was about trying to be better, to make each day count. But the shadows of his past weren't so easily forgotten. Daryl hadn't returned after their encounter, though Marcus had hoped he would. The silence from Daryl was deafening, and Marcus wondered if his old friend had truly forgiven him, or if he was still carrying the bitterness from all those years ago. One evening, as Marcus was closing up the center, he got another unexpected call, but this time it wasn't from Jamal. It was Daryl. "Marcus," Daryl's voice came through the line, rough but not angry. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said." Marcus felt his heart race. "Yeah? I think I was wrong too," Daryl admitted, his tone softer than Marcus had ever expected. "I've been holding on to this grudge for way too long. It's eating me up, man. I can't keep doing this. You're right. I can't fix what happened, but maybe we can move forward." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of Daryl's words settle over him. The walls he had built around his past, the fears and the guilt, seemed to crumble just a little. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. "I'm glad to hear you say that, Daryl," Marcus replied, his voice filled with emotion. "I've been waiting for this too. It's not going to be easy, but we can figure it out." There was a long pause on the other end before Daryl spoke again. "Yeah, maybe we can." When they hung up, Marcus stood there for a moment, the quiet of the night surrounding him. He wasn't sure what the future held for him and Daryl, but for the first time, he felt like there was a possibility of healing, of redemption, not just for him, but for both of them. The following days brought new challenges, but also new opportunities. The youth center flourished as Marcus continued to dedicate himself to the kids, teaching them not just how to fight, but how to live with integrity, how to learn from their mistakes, and how to rise above adversity. He began to see changes in them, small moments of growth, whether it was in their discipline or their attitude toward each other. They weren't just learning to defend themselves physically, they were learning to stand up for each other, to confront their struggles head-on, just as Marcus had been doing. As time passed, Marcus's relationship with the community around him deepened. The neighborhood, once defined by its struggles, was starting to shift. People saw Marcus not as a former MMA champion with a troubled past, but as someone who was trying to make a difference. His efforts weren't perfect, but they were real. He was showing up every day, putting in the work, and that meant something. And then one day, Daryl showed up at the center. He was standing by the door when Marcus arrived, his presence unspoken but undeniable. There was no confrontation this time, no anger in Daryl's eyes, just a quiet understanding. "You've been busy," Daryl said with a slight grin, his arms crossed. Marcus laughed, feeling the weight of the past year lift just a little more. "Yeah, I've been trying to stay out of trouble." Daryl chuckled, shaking his head. "You know, I never thought I'd see the day when you'd be the one giving the advice." "I'm just trying to make up for what I did," Marcus said, his tone more reflective than it had been before, "and trying to do right by these kids." Daryl nodded, stepping closer. "I see it. I see the change in you. It's good, Marcus. I think we're both learning in our own ways." Marcus looked at Daryl, the weight of everything they had been through hanging between them, but not suffocating them. "Yeah, I guess we are." As the sun set over the neighborhood, the two men stood side by side, their pasts finally starting to feel like distant memories. The future wasn't guaranteed, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were walking forward together. And in that moment, Marcus knew he had made the right choice. He had faced the darkness of his past, and while it hadn't been easy, it had brought him to this place, a place of reconciliation, growth, and most importantly, a second chance.